there were 4 states that have at least a quarter of the bench, or I'm sorry, at least a fifth of the bench made up of minority judges. Hawaii is kind of an exception here. They have about 65% minority judges. But there are 3 additional states where about 20% of the bench is made up of minorities. As far as women, about 26% of state court judges nationwide are women. But there are a few states that have significantly more women than others. About a third of judges are women in 6 states. But one of the other interesting features that we saw is pretty much the norm for most states to have higher percentages of women judges than minority judges. But there were a few states where this was not the case, where there was actually a higher percentage of minority judges than women judges. Your neighbor Missouri is one of those states. I'll start off talking about what relationships we found with respect to the selection method. There are 6 ways that judges can be selected for the bench. One is obviously merit selection, where you have a nominating commission that screens applicants, identifies the most highly qualified, and sends those names to the governor, who appoints someone from the list. There are also states that use a gubernatorial appointment system, usually with some kind of legislative confirmation, basically a federal model. As you know very well, in Kansas, judges can be chosen in partisan elections. Many states have nonpartisan elections. In a couple of states, legislatures choose judges. And then sometimes vacancies are filled by the Supreme Court or the Chief Justice making those appointments. So those are the 6 methods that we're dealing with. For our judges, the judges in our data set, we wanted to identify what the most common method of selection was for minority and women judges. One of the things that I think you'll find striking as I talk about my results is that there are differences. We don't see the same types of characteristics leading to more minorities on the bench that lead to more women on the bench. We're talking about different factors that matter in diversifying the bench on the basis of race and diversifying the bench on the basis of gender. We also see differences across the 3 levels of courts. With the exception of one factor that I'll talk about at the end, I think this presents a challenge because if you're talking about what can be done to promote diversity, it depends on which kind you're talking about and what level of court you're talking about. But you'll see that as I talk about the results. First of all, selection methods. For courts of last resort, state Supreme Courts, the most common method for reaching the bench for both minorities and women was merit selection. More than half of minority judges were chosen through a merit selection process. Almost half of women judges were chosen through a merit selection process. For courts of appeals, we still find that merit selection is beneficial to minorities. This was the most common selection method for minorities on intermediate appellate courts as well. For women, it was partisan election, but it was very close. I think 2 percentage points between partisan elections and merit selection. And then finally, for trial court judges, we find more minorities being chosen through gubernatorial appointment, but more women being chosen through merit selection. We also, as I mentioned, we looked at legal qualifications for serving as a judge. The minimum age requirement and a minimum legal experience requirement. With respect to age, we didn't find any particular relationships with regard to minorities, but it was interesting. We found that a lower percentage of women judges were found on courts that had a minimum, on courts of last resort, state Supreme Courts that had a minimum age requirement. But as far as legal qualifications and minority judges, we found substantially higher percentages of minority judges on state Supreme Courts and trial courts in states that had a minimum legal experience qualification. Usually it's 5 years, sometimes it's as high as 10 years, but in states that had those, for the high court and the trial court, they had much higher percentages of minority judges. We also looked at the political environment, the party of those who were involved in selecting judges. For those judges who were appointed by the governor, either through pure gubernatorial appointment or through some kind of a merit selection process. Nationwide, Democratic governors appointed higher percentages of minority and women judges than did Republicans. The disparities were particularly strong for minorities on... I thought I was going to be looking at this as I did it. Particularly strong discrepancies between minorities appointed to Supreme Courts by Democratic and Republican governors, and for women appointed to intermediate courts of appeals by Democratic and Republican governors. Then for those judges that were chosen through partisan or nonpartisan elections, we looked at the makeup of the electorate in that state, basing it on the vote for the presidential candidate in the most recent election. In Democratic-dominated states, minority candidates did better as well. Another factor that we looked at was the region of the country. I think results here aren't too surprising. We didn't find any strong relationships for women in terms of higher percentages of women in one region or another, but we did find significantly fewer minority judges in the Midwest, which includes Kansas, and the higher percentages of minority judges in the Northeast. The final factor that we looked at, what we did at this point was sort of throw all of these characteristics, all of these factors into a single model, but we added the percentage of minority attorneys in the state at the time the judge was selected, and the percentage of women attorneys in the state at the time the judge was selected, ran the model. This was, we talked about differences for women and minorities and differences across levels of courts. This was the factor that consistently mattered for all levels of courts and for women and minorities, with one exception that I'll talk about in a minute. It's not surprising, but it confirms something that we've talked about already, that we need minority attorneys, women attorneys, in order to get a more diverse bench. The only exception was for women on state Supreme Courts. It didn't matter what the attorney pool looked like in terms of women getting selected to state Supreme Courts. Perhaps this suggests that to governors or to the electorates there's some kind of symbolic significance in having at least one woman on your Supreme Court, although, as Ciara mentioned, there are 2 states that don't have that, and one of them is a merit selection state, I'm embarrassed to say. But I'd like to finish up with this finding because I think it reinforces what we're going to be talking about in the next panel in terms of steps that can be taken to enhance diversity, and it really is about looking at pipeline issues, how to encourage people to want to become judges, kind of a mentoring issue as well, and I think that's part of what this initiative is about.